They said she was infected. They whispered it like a sin, wrote it into history like a warning, not a wound. But what if the infection wasn't an illness at all, but something that seeps through every royal marriage? Obedience, silence, and duty disguised as love. She was born into a rising European dynasty, promised palaces and power, and somehow ended up alone in an abbey, forgotten even by the kingdom that made her. A princess so royal, she should have been remembered forever. And yet most people today couldn't tell you her name. It wasn't magic that erased her. It was history, selective, polite, and always allergic to tragedy that doesn't look beautiful enough on postcards. You're here now, drifting through time with me. So before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. It's the least we can do for the ones history forgot. And tell me, what time is it where you are tonight? I like to imagine we're scattered across the world, all awake with the same story. So let's go back. Not to the romance, not to the empire, but to where the infection first began. The year is 1864 in Brussels. The city still smells faintly of newness, rain on stone, horses clattering past unfinished palaces, the slow hum of a country trying to convince itself it belongs among the great empires of Europe. And at the center of all that ambition sits a palace so immaculate, so polished, that even the air inside seems to hold its breath. That's where she was born, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, a child destined to be a symbol long before she learned to speak. The second daughter of King Leopold II, who preferred his marble to his children, and Queen Marie Henriette, who found motherhood only slightly less exhausting than being married to Leopold. Imagine a childhood spent in a palace where emotions were considered unsanitary. The chandeliers glittered, the mirrors sparkled, and the children were expected to do the same. Warmth was something imported, like silk from France or gossip from Vienna. Even bedtime stories were strategic, moral fables about obedience, virtue, and why kings never cry. Leopold II, her father, was a man born with an architect's mind and an accountant's heart. While other rulers commissioned gardens, he was quietly drawing maps of Africa. He wanted land, wealth, and immortality, not necessarily in that order. To the world, he would one day be remembered as the Builder King, but history would eventually give him another title, the Butcher of the Congo. But that's still years away. For now, he's just the father who strides through the halls, smelling faintly of cigars and conquest, measuring everything, from staircases to daughters, in terms of value. Stéphanie's mother, Marie Henriette, was his perfect opposite. She had been a Habsburg, Austrian royalty through and through. And when she arrived in Belgium, she found the climate disagreeable, the people peculiar, and her husband unbearable. She loved music, horses, and long absences. She did not, unfortunately, love Leopold. Their marriage was less a partnership than a political treaty with excellent handwriting. So, in that glittering Belgian palace, young Stéphanie grew up between two people who had long since stopped speaking to each other except through public ceremony. It's not that they hated one another. That would have required energy. They simply ignored each other with royal efficiency. When you grow up in a home where affection is rationed, you learn early to find warmth elsewhere. Stéphanie learned to be quiet, not out of fear, but out of survival. Silence in her world was the most reliable form of safety. At dinners, she would sit still as her father discussed building railways and acquiring colonies, while her mother drifted in and out of the conversation like a ghost, who occasionally made witty remarks about the weather. The air was always slightly too cold, the silver slightly too polished, and every word felt weighed before it was spoken. The Belgian royal family was young, ambitious, and desperate to be taken seriously by Europe's older monarchies. The English had their empire, the French had their charm, the Austrians had their pedigree. Belgium, on the other hand, had a king who collected ideas for expansion, the way other men collected clocks. In that house, emotions were simply impractical. Love didn't build nations, duty did. And that, though no one could see it at the time, was Stéphanie's first infection. Not the kind you can treat with medicine, but the kind you inherit by proximity. A slow, quiet understanding that to survive among rulers, you must first learn to become a statue. Her childhood lessons came not from fairy tales, but from observation. She learned that being loved and being useful were two entirely different things, and only one of them was expected of her. When she smiled, the court approved. When she cried, the maids closed the doors. Still, there were moments of softness. Her elder sister Louise was lively, charming, and, much to the Queen's dismay, a bit of a handful. They'd whisper under the heavy velvet drapes, inventing stories about the portraits of dead ancestors. Stéphanie would ask why none of them looked happy, and Louise would answer, because they married for the country. Even as a child, she understood that her future was already written in the family calendar. She would be educated, presented, married off. Another carefully placed tile in Europe's dynastic mosaic. It was comforting in a way. When your path is decided for you, you never have to wonder where you're going, only how gracefully you'll get there. Her father would occasionally visit the nursery, not to play, but to observe. He'd compliment her manners the way one might admire a well-built bridge. Her mother, meanwhile, floated in and out like perfume, present in traces, gone by morning. When she was home, the Queen would take the girls to the stables, where she seemed genuinely happy for the first time. Horses at least didn't talk back. The palace itself was a kingdom of cold hands, marble floors, oil portraits that never blinked, and courtiers who smiled as if paid per gesture. It echoed more than it laughed. And in that echo, Stéphanie learned patience. It would serve her well, though she could never know just how much patience her future would demand. In the winter of 1869, the palace fell quiet for a different reason. Her brother, Prince Leopold, heir to the throne, the golden child who carried the weight of Belgium's continuity, fell ill. He was 9. The doctors came and went in carriages that rattled down the frozen streets. Prayers were whispered. Candles were lit. In royal families, death isn't just a tragedy. It's a logistical crisis. When the boy died, the nation mourned its heir. The family mourned privately, behind drawn curtains and controlled expressions. Stéphanie was only 4.5, old enough to notice the way people walked slower, spoke softer, and avoided her mother's eyes. The court expected the king to grieve like a monarch, not a father. He obliged. There were speeches, ceremonies, and the proper number of tears. Then the king returned to his desk, and the queen returned to her horses, and the palace returned to its silence. For a child, grief without comfort becomes confusion. Stéphanie tried to ask where her brother had gone, but the adults changed the subject. Eventually, she stopped asking. Silence was, after all, the family language. That winter, she stood by a window overlooking the gardens, her small hand pressed to the cold glass, and realized that even when the snow melted, the air inside never would. That was the night childhood ended, not with a scream or a storm, but with the kind of stillness that becomes permanent, the kind that seeps into your bones until it feels normal. And so, the little girl who should have been surrounded by affection instead learned to build walls out of etiquette, to wear composure like armor. It wasn't cruelty that shaped her. It was neglect, polished and perfumed into something that looked respectable. Years later, people would call her graceful, obedient, serene, as if those were virtues. But they were symptoms. The infection had already taken root, the coldness of duty. The palace never laughed again the same way after her brother's death. Conversations became quieter, dinners shorter, and the rooms, somehow, larger. The king devoted himself entirely to the business of empire, the queen to her own private distances. The surviving daughters became decorations in mourning clothes, and in that frozen household, Stéphanie's heart learned its first rule, that love is dangerous because when it leaves, it takes the warmth with it. That night, the palace went silent. It never thawed again. By the winter of 1871, Brussels had begun to smell different. Not of bread or rain or horses, but of disinfectant. That sharp, sour tang that slips under every door and tells you, without words, that something has gone wrong. The newspapers spoke politely about a passing outbreak, but everyone in the capital knew the truth. Typhus had arrived. A sickness that didn't care about status or title, that crossed polished gates and muddy alleys with equal ease. It began with a fever, then the kind of exhaustion that made even breathing feel like disobedience. And it had a cruel habit of leaving families smaller than it found them. In the palace, the staff whispered in corridors, pressing handkerchiefs to their faces. Servants were dismissed for their safety, though it was really to keep appearances. And in a nursery gilded in pale gold, a 7-year-old princess coughed for the first time. At first, no one thought much of it. Children were supposed to cough, to shiver, to make their nurses panic. But by the second night, the fever was high enough to turn the world strange. Stéphanie stopped asking for water because she wasn't sure if her throat still belonged to her. She stared at the ceiling and watched the patterns move. Angels one moment, shadows the next. The doctors arrived, carrying their black bags like coffins for secrets. They were confident, competent, and entirely powerless. They called it typhus, prescribed rest, and left polite assurances that the princess was young and strong. But even the youngest and strongest could feel death breathing down their necks when the fever rose high enough. Somewhere between waking and delirium, Stéphanie wondered if this was what queens felt like when they faded. All her life she'd been told that royal blood was sacred, a divine thread spun through generations. Yet, lying there drenched in sweat, she didn't feel divine. She felt human, terrifyingly so. Outside, the palace smelled of vinegar and carbolic acid, a cocktail of desperation and hygiene. Nurses scrubbed until their hands bled. Servants whispered prayers over trays of cold soup. Even her father, King Leopold II, who never admitted to fearing anything that couldn't be colonized, avoided her room. It wasn't heartlessness. It was superstition, dressed in royal etiquette. The sickness didn't just infect bodies, it infected courage. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, came and went in quiet bursts of worry, never staying long enough to be seen breaking down. The Queen of the Belgians was expected to embody serenity, even while her daughter burned with fever in the next room. She brought flowers once, lilies naturally, and set them by the bedside. Stephanie later told a nurse she hated them. "They smell like church," she said, "and the church smells like endings." For days, she hovered in that strange half-world where dreams and memory blur. Sometimes she thought she heard her brother laughing, the one who had died 2 years before. Sometimes she thought she saw him sitting at the end of her bed, telling her stories about the stars. And sometimes, when the fever was at its cruelest, she imagined she was already a ghost, watching her own small body struggle beneath the sheets. To a child raised among marble and mirrors, the fragility of flesh came as a revelation. The court had taught her that illness was a form of weakness, something to be hidden behind lace and titles. But here, in the quiet delirium of her own body, weakness felt almost holy. For the first time, she wasn't being watched, measured, or corrected. She was simply existing, halfway between life and whatever comes next. The palace chaplain came to pray beside her bed, whispering Latin over her head. She couldn't understand the words, but the rhythm felt safe, like being rocked to sleep by an old song she almost remembered. The nurse later said that when he finished, Stephanie mumbled, "If I wake up, I'll try to be good." It was a child's promise, innocent and heavy at the same time. Outside her window, Brussels carried on pretending it was fine. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones slick with winter rain. Courtiers wrote letters about trivialities. Who was visiting? Who was ill? Who was pretending not to be? And through it all, a small candle burned in Stephanie's room, flickering like a pulse refusing to stop. The days blurred. Morning and night lost meaning. Her world shrank to the sound of her own breathing and the cool hands of the nurse who dabbed her forehead with vinegar water. Once, the fever broke, briefly, and she woke to find her sheets soaked through. She asked the nurse if she had melted. The woman smiled and said, "No, Highness, you're still here." Stephanie thought about that for a long time. Still here. The words sounded like both a gift and a warning. When the fever returned, it came quieter, more determined. The doctors whispered now when they entered, their Latin replaced by sighs. Someone called for the priest again. Someone else suggested writing a letter just in case. And for a single terrifying day, even the servants stopped gossiping. That was how you knew it was serious, when the palace went silent. No one knows exactly what turned the tide. Perhaps it was the steady care of her nurse, or the fact that children have an inconvenient habit of surviving when adults least expect it. But one morning, the fever was simply gone. Stephanie opened her eyes and found sunlight spilling across the ceiling. The shadows were still there, but now they seemed harmless. Just light playing tricks, not omens. The doctors called it a miracle. Her father called it relief. Her mother called for her carriage. Recovery, however, was not just physical. Something inside her had shifted. She was 7, and already she had seen the edge of her world dissolve and then reform. She understood instinctively that life was borrowed, not promised, that even princesses could vanish without fanfare. When she finally stood again, she was smaller somehow, not in size, but in certainty. The nurse noticed it first, the way she stared longer out the window, the way she asked quieter questions. "Why do people pray only when they're afraid?" she asked once. "Because it works best then," the nurse said. Stephanie had nodded, but she wasn't convinced. In the palace, life resumed its usual rhythm, less concerned with who had almost died and more focused on upcoming dinners. The word typhus became impolite, replaced with the more comfortable phrase, her recent indisposition. The doctors were thanked and dismissed. The servants replaced the disinfectant with roses. But in the quiet hours, when she couldn't sleep, Stéphanie would trace the small scars left by the illness, the thinning of her hair, the pallor of her skin, and wonder what had been left behind. Not the disease itself, but something subtler, an awareness that everything she loved could disappear overnight. It was, in a way, her baptism. Not into religion, though she would later become deeply devout, but into fragility, into the understanding that strength was not the absence of weakness, but the art of carrying it gracefully. The court called her survival providence. The servants called it luck. Her father called it evidence of good breeding. But none of them saw what the illness had truly given her, a private certainty that even kings and queens were made of breakable things. From then on, she began to notice sickness everywhere, not in bodies, but in behavior, the cough of vanity, the fever of pride, the slow infection of indifference that spread faster than any disease. She didn't have the words for it yet, but she had the instinct. Something in the world was wrong, and it wasn't just her. And so, when the whispers began, that faint rustle of superstition that trails every royal illness, she listened. Some said the fever had changed her temperament. Others claimed she'd been touched by God. A few murmured darker things, that an infection like that never really leaves, that once you've been marked by it, part of you will always carry the shadow. Children aren't supposed to remember near death clearly. But Stéphanie did. She remembered the taste of water turning metallic on her tongue. She remembered her mother's perfume mixed with disinfectant. She remembered the flicker of the candle that burned through every night beside her bed, as if daring the darkness to try again. And she remembered the silence that followed her recovery, the kind of silence that feels like everyone's afraid to mention what almost happened. In that silence, she learned something essential. Miracles don't come free. They always take something in return. Years later, when people spoke of her resilience, of how she survived scandal, disease, and heartbreak, they'd call her strong. But she knew better. She wasn't strong. She was indebted. Every breath, every reprieve felt borrowed. They said she survived by a miracle. But miracles always demand repayment. And since you've made it this far into her story, the least you can do is make sure she isn't forgotten twice. Go on, subscribe. It's the easiest kind of remembrance there is. If childhood had been cold, adolescence was polished. By 13, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium was no longer a child. She was in preparation. Not for a particular job, or even a passion, but for a purpose so vague it could fit on a monogrammed teacup, to be a credit to her family. Her education was less about learning and more about refinement. A kind of royal carpentry, sanding off splinters of individuality until she could fit seamlessly into the furniture of monarchy. The mornings began with languages: French, German, English, and the occasional dabble in Italian. Not because she'd ever speak to an Italian, but because it sounded sophisticated to know how. Her tutors said multilingualism was the mark of a cultured princess. Stéphanie suspected it was just a polite way of saying, "You'll be ignored in several languages now." After that came posture, a subject as serious in royal education as theology. She was taught how to glide rather than walk, how to fold herself into a curtsy deep enough to suggest humility, but not so deep as to imply servitude. Her spine became a moral compass, Never slouch, never bow too long, never lean toward comfort. Afternoons were for music and manners, the twin pillars of female acceptability. She practiced the piano until her fingers ached, then practiced smiling through it. Grace, her tutor reminded her, is the art of concealing effort. Stéphanie got so good at concealing effort that by 16 she could suppress both yawns and opinions with equal precision. The Belgian palace by then had evolved from home to institution, a finishing school, disguised as a royal residence. The walls themselves seemed to enforce discipline. Even the clocks ticked politely, as if afraid to offend. Servants glided noiselessly. Conversation was measured in tone and volume, and laughter was rationed like sugar during wartime. Every young royal learns early that silence is safer than sincerity. Stéphanie, ever the observant student, learned quickly that the less she said, the more people liked her. When guests complimented her beauty, she thanked them modestly. When they complimented her intelligence, she thanked them even more modestly. A princess, after all, could be admired for many things. Intellect was rarely encouraged to be one of them. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, occasionally checked in, more as supervisor than parent. The queen would sweep into the room, correct a slouch, and remind her daughter that a true princess never makes people uncomfortable with honesty. Then she would leave again, trailing perfume and obligation. Her father, King Leopold II, was more concerned with maps than manners. He treated family life as a secondary kingdom, useful for producing heirs and political alliances, but otherwise tedious. When he did take an interest in his daughters, it was usually to evaluate them like investments. "Louise has charm," he once said, "but too much curiosity. Stéphanie has discipline. That may be safer." It wasn't exactly praise, but in royal circles, safe was the closest thing to affection. In this sterile environment, Stéphanie's lessons took on a philosophical edge. History wasn't taught as narrative, but as caution. Every tale of a fallen monarch was presented as a moral fable about disobedience. Queens who thought too loudly were beheaded, banished, or, worst of all, forgotten. The message was clear. Survival belonged to the agreeable. It was during these years that she began to understand the family's true religion: duty. It governed every gesture, every silence, every breath taken for the sake of decorum. And yet, beneath the layers of obedience, something in her resisted. Not rebellion. She wasn't foolish enough for that. But awareness. A quiet suspicion that there was something fundamentally wrong with a world that rewarded endurance more than joy. When she was 15, one of her governesses, a kind woman with unfashionably human emotions, caught Stéphanie staring at herself in the mirror. "You're frowning," the governess said. "A princess should look content even when she's thinking." "I'm not thinking," Stéphanie replied. "I'm remembering." Remembering what? What it felt like to be allowed to sneeze. The governess laughed, softly but genuinely. That was the first time Stéphanie realized that humor was a form of freedom, small, secret, and dangerously pleasant. By 16, she had mastered everything a royal woman needed to master: embroidery, conversation, the art of fainting without wrinkling one's gown. She could play the piano sweetly enough to charm diplomats and listen long enough to make them believe they were interesting. She had become, in every visible sense, perfect. And that was the problem. Perfection, in royal training, wasn't a state. It was a performance. And the better you performed, the more you disappeared behind it. Stéphanie was no longer seen as a person in progress, but as a finished product ready for export. The question wasn't if she'd marry, but who would make the most profitable claim. In Belgium, they called it diplomacy. In practice, it was merchandising. The courtiers began to whisper potential names the way one might suggest suitable wallpaper. There was a Russian cousin, a Spanish duke, even a Danish prince rumored to have excellent posture. But none seemed quite right, until the winter of 1878, when a visitor arrived from Vienna. He was older, 20 to her 14, but in the arithmetic of royal unions, that hardly mattered. What mattered was his bloodline, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Crown Prince Rudolf. To Europe, he was a prize. To his father, a headache. To Stéphanie, at first, merely a stranger with sad eyes and the faint impatience of a man born too early for his century. He visited Brussels with the weight of an empire trailing behind him, accompanied by diplomats, attendants, and an aura of both privilege and melancholy. At a state dinner he sat beside her, protocol dictated it, and asked if she liked Vienna. She said she'd never been. He smiled and said, "That's the best way to like it." The conversation barely lasted 5 minutes, but for Stéphanie it was the first unscripted exchange she'd ever had with a man outside her family. He didn't compliment her manners or inquire about her embroidery. He asked about books, about music, about whether she ever got tired of being watched. It was disarming, not flirtatious, not grand, simply human. After he left, she found herself thinking about his voice. Quick, restless, the kind that carried too many thoughts for one body. Later, she'd learned that Rudolf was a man constantly at war with himself, the perfect heir to a collapsing empire, groomed to rule, but cursed to feel. But that night, all she knew was that he seemed alive in a way most royals weren't allowed to be. The court noticed their brief interaction and did what courts do best, turned it into prophecy. Within weeks, rumors circulated of a potential match. The king considered it an opportunity. The queen, a relief. Stéphanie, meanwhile, was told to keep smiling. Her tutors doubled down. Posture, language, etiquette, all fine-tuned now with imperial precision. She was being prepared not for life, but for presentation. The transformation was nearly complete. If you asked her then how she felt, she might have said, "Ready." But beneath that readiness was a quiet question she could never voice aloud. Ready for what exactly? For marriage? For duty? For disappearance? The truth was, she didn't know. No one ever told her what came after obedience, only that it was impolite to ask. So she kept studying, kept curtsying, kept learning how to smile tighter than truth. She became fluent not only in languages, but in the subtle dialects of silence, the tone of a disapproving glance, the pause before gossip, the art of saying yes while meaning perhaps if I must. And through it all she carried that small, private infection of awareness, the one she'd caught years earlier, in the Palace of Cold Hands. The belief that pain, when endured quietly, was a form of virtue. That discomfort was proof of worth. That happiness was, well, optional. This was the royal infection, the hereditary belief that suffering was simply part of the crown's design. In another story, perhaps, she might have rebelled. But Stéphanie didn't rebel. She adapted. She learned to survive by blending in, to thrive by appearing content. And so, by 17, when the world began to whisper her name beside Rudolf's, she was ready. Ready to be chosen, ready to be claimed, ready to play her part in a drama that would soon outgrow her control. That winter, the carriages rolled through the palace gates carrying letters from Vienna, formal, delicate, and heavy with destiny. And somewhere, in a candlelit drawing room, a princess sat by the window, staring out at the snow, not yet knowing that the man with restless eyes would change everything. Her education was nearly complete, and soon the real test would begin. Vienna, 1881. The air smelled of horses, champagne, and the kind of optimism that only empires can afford. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and the city, draped in ribbons of gold and silk, pretended to believe in fairy tales again. After all, the Crown Prince of Austria was getting married, and the bride, a 17-year-old Belgian princess named Stéphanie, whose greatest achievement to date had been doing exactly what she was told. To the outside world, it looked perfect, an empire at its peak, a wedding that promised to secure alliances, strengthen dynasties, and ideally, produce a male heir who wouldn't ask too many questions about modern politics. Inside the palace, however, everyone was whispering, not about love, but about logistics. The marriage had been arranged with the delicacy of a financial merger. Letters flew back and forth between Brussels and Vienna, all full of diplomatic flattery and barely disguised bargaining. The Austrians wanted a healthy, respectable Catholic bride. Belgium wanted influence, prestige, and a daughter successfully exported. Everyone got what they wanted, except the two people actually involved. Stéphanie arrived in Vienna full of naive anticipation. She had been raised to believe that marriage was a prize, not a partnership. That if she played her role perfectly, happiness would simply appear on schedule, like a well-timed carriage. Vienna, she thought, would be her new beginning. A glittering court, a charming husband, perhaps even affection. Instead, what she found was a theater. The Habsburg Empire was built on pageantry. Everything had a script, from breakfast to heartbreak. Court life revolved around etiquette so intricate it might as well have been a form of currency. And presiding over it all was Emperor Franz Joseph, Rudolf's father, whose sense of duty was legendary and whose capacity for warmth was, shall we say, less so. The emperor believed in order, in God, and in the quiet efficiency of disappointment. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, known to history as Sisi, believed in poetry, dieting, and escaping the palace as often as possible. Between them stood Rudolf, their only son, a restless, intelligent young man who had inherited his father's sense of duty and his mother's melancholy. It was an unfortunate combination. Rudolf didn't believe in love either. He believed in science, liberal politics, and the occasional scandal. He read forbidden books, corresponded with radicals, and had a habit of disagreeing with his father about nearly everything. In modern terms, he was a rebel. In imperial terms, he was a disappointment with excellent tailoring. When Stéphanie met him again, this time officially betrothed, she was struck by how tired he looked for a man in his 20s. He smiled politely, complimented her on her composure, and went back to staring at the floor. It wasn't exactly romantic, but her governess whispered, "He's shy," which in royal translation meant, "He's complicated, and you'll be blamed for it later." The months leading up to the wedding were a master class in denial. Stéphanie was paraded before courtiers, fitted for gowns, trained in Austrian protocol, and subtly reminded that her opinions had been checked at the border. Rudolf spent most of his time hunting or avoiding family dinners. Rumors of his affairs circulated like secondhand smoke, impossible to contain, impolite to mention. And yet, when the bells rang on May 10th, 1881, Vienna celebrated as though a fairy tale were being written. The wedding itself was an event of dizzying spectacle. The cathedral glittered with jewels, the orchestra drowned in trumpets, and every candle seemed determined to outshine the bride. Stephanie's gown was a masterpiece of silk and symbolism, heavy, ornate, and almost impossible to walk in without assistance. It was less a dress than a declaration of empire. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel thousands of eyes on her, judging her posture, her modesty, her suitability. She kept her face composed, her steps steady, her thoughts quiet. Across the aisle, Rudolf waited, pale and distracted, looking for all the world like a man attending his own sentencing. It was said the emperor smiled. It was said the bride did not. The ceremony went perfectly, of course. Everything did in public. There were oaths, rings, blessings, applause. Stephanie became Crown Princess of Austria, a title that sounded grand until you realized it mostly involved existing decoratively near important men. That night, as the empire celebrated, the newlyweds withdrew to the palace. It was supposed to be their first moment alone, their private beginning. Instead, it was their first shared silence. Rudolf, polite as always, tried to make conversation. Stephanie, terrified and exhausted, tried to answer. Both quickly realized that the only thing they had in common was the expectation that neither of them would ever truly be understood. He offered her wine. She declined. He told her about his travels, his studies, his frustration with court life. She listened, smiling in all the right places. He spoke of freedom. She thought of safety. They were standing inches apart, but might as well have been continents away. At one point, she asked softly, "Do you think we'll be happy?" He looked at her, really looked, and said, "Happiness is for people who have time." It was not the answer she'd imagined as a child, dreaming of crowns and carriages. But it was honest, and honesty in her world was already a rarity. Outside, the celebrations continued into the early hours, fireworks, music, laughter. Inside, two strangers sat under chandeliers that threw light sharp enough to make everything shimmer but nothing glow. She watched the reflection of her wedding gown in the mirror, the lace, the jewels, the golden embroidery. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it looked like armor. In that moment, she understood something that no tutor had ever taught her. Marriage in royal circles wasn't about joining two hearts. It was about merging two public images into one tolerable illusion. Rudolf excused himself early, citing fatigue. She was left alone, surrounded by luxury that felt more like confinement. When she finally lay down, the bed was enormous, carved with cherubs who stared down in perpetual, judgmental sympathy. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine home, Belgium, the cold palace, the simpler pain of familiarity. But even memory had betrayed her. There was no going back. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, Vienna roared in celebration. Inside, a young princess stared into the dark and realized that fairy tales always leave out what happens after the wedding. There was no scandal that night, no cruel outburst, no tragedy. Just a quiet, suffocating emptiness. The beginning of a life she hadn't chosen, with a man who didn't believe in love, in a world that mistook obedience for devotion. History would call it a grand union. The newspapers would describe it as a radiant day for Europe. But behind the curtains, behind the music and the gold, a mirror cracked just slightly, too faint for anyone to hear. and the reflection it left behind would haunt her forever. The Hofburg Palace was the kind of place where nothing died, at least not officially. Flowers wilted quietly behind velvet curtains. Servants aged without permission. Even the chandeliers seemed to hang on out of sheer politeness. It was a palace that believed in appearance above all else, where the furniture shone brighter than the people, and silence could smother anything, especially the truth. Stephanie, Crown Princess of Austria, had learned quickly how to survive there. The rules were simple. Speak softly, never contradict anyone older than the building, and, above all, pretend. Pretend the court adored her. Pretend her husband loved her. Pretend she was the kind of woman history wanted her to be. The marriage, on paper, was thriving. She and Rudolf had a daughter, Elizabeth Marie, born in 1883. The baby was healthy, the empire rejoiced, and everyone exhaled the collective sigh of people who really just wanted something new to gossip about. The Habsburgs had their heir. Well, technically, their heiress. But that was an inconvenient detail everyone decided to overlook for now. But behind the draped windows and the parade of polite congratulations, something was already rotting. Rudolf had never been a model husband. Even before the wedding, Vienna's rumor mills had been grinding out stories of his late-night adventures, his drinking, his politics, his indiscretions. After marriage, he didn't bother to hide them. The palace staff grew used to seeing strange carriages arrive after midnight and strangers leave before dawn. He was charming when he wanted to be, brilliant in conversation, impossible to ignore. But there was a restlessness in him that no title, no wife, no empire could soothe. He wanted freedom in a world that prized obedience. And like most trapped men, he found his rebellion in self-destruction. For a while, Stephanie tried to bridge the gap. She excused the absences, endured the gossip, smiled at the dinners. Every time he returned smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, she told herself that it was just how royal marriages worked. Love was for novels. In real life, there was dignity. But there were limits even to dignity. And one morning, those limits arrived in the form of a fever. It began like a cold. Headaches, fatigue, strange aches in places too embarrassing to mention aloud. The palace doctors came, bowed, and diagnosed her with a slight inflammation of the abdomen. Their tone suggested it was more etiquette than medicine. She was ordered to rest, to pray, and to stop worrying. The problem, of course, was that doctors in the 19th century often treated royal women like fragile furniture. No one dared ask how she'd fallen ill, because to do so would invite scandal. Scandal led to questions, and questions led to truth. And the Habsburgs had no use for that particular contagion. Eventually, after too many sleepless nights, someone whispered the real diagnosis behind closed doors. Syphilis. Not that anyone would ever say the word to her face. It was written in euphemisms. A delicate condition, an unfortunate infection, a private misfortune. The doctors spoke in Latin, as if language itself might contain the shame. At first, Stephanie refused to believe it. Diseases like that belonged to the streets, not to marble palaces, not to her. But the symptoms didn't care about class. They came and stayed and left reminders. It was Rudolf, of course. Her husband, the future emperor, the chosen heir, the man celebrated as the empire's brightest hope, had infected his wife before she was 22. And with that one act, he destroyed not just her health, but her future. The infection left her unable to have more children. In a dynasty obsessed with lineage, it was the cruelest blow imaginable. A Habsburg wife who couldn't produce an heir was like a decorative vase with a crack, still displayed but no longer trusted. When the doctors told her, they did so with the kind of professional distance usually reserved for funerals. They called it unfortunate, permanent, and best kept confidential. No one dared say the truth plainly. She was ruined. Rudolf didn't apologize. He didn't even deny it. He was too wrapped in his own unraveling, his political despair, his drinking, his disillusionment with an empire that prized obedience over progress. In his mind, he was a victim too, of duty, of family, of a life that had never belonged to him. But for Stéphanie, the betrayal was total. She had followed every rule, every expectation, every instruction given to her since childhood. She had played the part of the perfect royal wife, graceful, patient, silent, and for that, she had been rewarded with disease and humiliation. She stopped sharing a bed with him after that. Officially, it was for her health. Unofficially, it was for her sanity. Their marriage became an arrangement of geography. They lived under the same roof, spoke at the same dinners, attended the same ceremonies, but they were separated by a silence thicker than stone. Vienna, ever observant, noticed. The rumors began again. The crown princess is distant. The crown prince is unhappy. They're both impossible. But no one dared say why. It was easier to invent stories than to face the real one. The irony, of course, was that Vienna itself was teeming with infections. Not just the medical kind, though there were plenty of those, but moral ones. Hypocrisy, vanity, denial. The city that prided itself on refinement was rotting from the inside, and Stéphanie, in her gilded isolation, could smell it. She began to notice the small things, how courtiers pretended not to hear when scandals were whispered, how priests blessed couples they knew were miserable, how the empire celebrated morality while quietly practicing anything but. Royal purity, she realized, was just well-dressed rot, and once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. She still did her duty, attended charities, smiled at receptions, played the part, but inside, something hardened. It wasn't bitterness exactly, but clarity. The infection had stripped away her illusions, and what remained was a kind of cold strength. One evening, she overheard two courtiers gossiping. Poor Stéphanie, one sighed, such a waste of promise. The other replied, well, at least she's still respectable. She almost laughed. Respectable. What a useless word. Respectable people caused more quiet suffering than villains ever could. Sometimes she wondered which was worse, the disease or the shame. The disease destroyed her body. The shame erased her personhood. The world would remember Rudolf as a tragic figure, brilliant and doomed. She would be remembered, if at all, as his collateral damage. But the real tragedy wasn't the illness. It was that she couldn't tell anyone. There were no friends, no confidants, no one who could share the weight without scandal. Even her own family in Belgium would treat her affliction like a moral failing. So she buried it deep, the way her father had buried compassion, the way her mother had buried affection. When the doctor came for the final time, he brought paperwork, not comfort. His words were rehearsed, his gaze averted. Your Highness, he said, I regret to inform you that further issue will not be possible. He meant children, of course, but to Stéphanie it sounded broader than that. No more issue, no more future, no more illusions. She nodded politely, as though he'd merely informed her of a scheduling conflict. When he left, she sat for a long time by the window, watching the city lights shimmer like distant stars, each one a life she could never have. History would call her infected, But it wasn't the disease that poisoned her. It was loyalty. And if that doesn't make you a little angry at how easily history buries its women, then maybe hit subscribe so at least one of us remembers her for the right reasons. Vienna had a way of pretending that nothing was wrong, even when everything was. It was a city addicted to appearances, where gossip was a sport, and denial was the reigning religion. Behind the carriages, the operas, the clinking of crystal glasses, there was always someone quietly falling apart. And now, one of those someones was the crown princess. After the scandal no one dared name, Stephanie became a kind of living secret. Not banished, not exactly, but politely removed from the circle of interest. Vienna didn't exile its broken women, it simply forgot them in well-decorated rooms. Her husband, Crown Prince Rudolf, had long since drifted into his own chaos. He spent nights in the company of actresses, aristocrats, and anyone who could make him forget he was an heir. He loved Vienna's smoky cafes, its politics, its scandal. Stephanie loved silence. That alone made them incompatible. In public, they were still the picture of royal composure. He, the dashing prince with liberal ideals. She, the dutiful wife with immaculate posture. But in private, they shared little more than air. She took to walking the corridors of the Habsburg palace late at night, long after the lamps had been dimmed. The portraits watched her, those stiff, powdered women who'd smiled through centuries of duty. Their eyes seemed to say, "We understand." There was Empress Maria Theresa, who'd borne 16 children and ruled like a man. Empress Elizabeth, her mother-in-law, who'd starved herself into myth. Every wall was lined with women who had endured in silence, their legacy reduced to portraits and porcelain. Stephanie had joined their ranks earlier than expected, not through death, but through irrelevance. The courtiers whispered, of course, they always did. The word sterile began circulating like a rumor dressed in mourning clothes. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It simply passed from one polished mouth to another, soft and poisonous. Poor princess, they'd murmur. So young and barren. It was a word colder than exile, one that froze her even in candlelight. You could be forgiven for scandal, for pride, even for betrayal. But infertility? That was a sin without redemption in a dynasty built entirely on succession. Her father, King Leopold II, wrote to her often. His letters were full of royal pragmatism and paternal disappointment. He had always measured love in usefulness, and now his daughter had become, in political terms, a regrettable investment. He told her to pray more, to find comfort in duty, to avoid public displays of despair. He did not tell her that he missed her. Leopold's affection was like his philanthropy, something he preferred to outsource. So, she prayed, not with the piety of faith, but with the desperation of someone trying to negotiate with fate. Every night she lit candles until her room glowed like a miniature cathedral. She prayed for strength, for forgiveness, for invisibility. Anything to stop feeling like a ghost in her own life. Vienna loved beauty, and the cruelest part of beauty is how indifferent it can be. Stephanie lived surrounded by it. Chandeliers, symphonies, gardens, trimmed to perfection. Everything gleamed while she withered. The city was a masterpiece painted over rot. Sometimes she attended concerts or galas, sitting beside her husband as if nothing had changed. But every time someone congratulated her on her poise, she felt the compliment land like a shovelful of dirt on her own coffin. Poise was just what they called women who suffered neatly. Even her daughter, little Elizabeth Marie, was slowly becoming a reminder of her failure, proof that once she had been capable of fulfilling her purpose. Stephanie adored her child, but every glance at the girl's face carried an echo of what she could no longer be. She spent more time in the palace chapel, where the marble saints looked mercifully disinterested. The priests spoke of redemption, but Stephanie suspected redemption was just forgiveness dressed in bureaucracy. Still, the act of kneeling gave her something to do, something between breathing and breaking. Prayer became less about God and more about gravity, a ritual that kept her anchored when her life was drifting away from her. The infection, once physical, had become something larger, invisible, incurable, unspeakable. It wasn't just in her body anymore. It was in the air she breathed, in the way people looked at her with sympathy that wasn't sympathy, in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. She was no longer infected with disease. She was infected with shame. And shame spreads quickly in a place where everyone is afraid of catching it. To keep herself from vanishing entirely, she began keeping a diary. Nothing dramatic, just observations, prayers, and small grievances. "Today," she wrote once, "I was praised for how well I endure. I am starting to think endurance is the only quality anyone truly expects from me." She was right. The empire didn't want women who loved or thought or rebelled. It wanted women who endured, quietly, beautifully, preferably without needing to be reminded. And then one night, the silence finally cracked. It began, as most scandals do, with whispers. The crown prince had fallen in love again, this time with a young baroness named Mary Wetzera. She was 17, full of devotion, and blissfully unaware that loving a Habsburg heir was like dancing on a chandelier, dazzling, but destined to end badly. Vienna, of course, was thrilled. Tragedy wrapped in romance was its favorite pastime. The newspapers pretended ignorance. The salons pretended outrage. The courtiers pretended it wasn't happening right under their noses. But for Stephanie, the news landed like a cruel echo of every truth she'd already learned. That loyalty was a one-way road. That duty didn't protect anyone. And that even in a palace of ghosts, she could still feel haunted. She didn't cry. She didn't confront him. She didn't even pray that night. She simply sat at her dressing table, staring into the mirror until her own reflection began to blur, and thought, "So this is how it happens. This is how women disappear, not all at once, but gradually, until even the walls forget their names." Outside, Vienna went on pretending. The carriages still rolled, the waltzes still played, and the palace still glittered with chandeliers that refused to dim. But somewhere in the heart of that golden city, a woman sat in silence, learning to live like a ghost. The infection had changed her once. Now the shame was finishing the job. And somewhere, in another wing of the palace, her husband laughed softly with his new mistress, as if nothing at all were cracking beneath their feet. January 1889. The Austrian winter was brutal that year, the kind that made even the mountains seem tired. Snow lay thick over the countryside, muffling everything but rumor. At Mayerling, a quiet hunting lodge tucked into the woods outside Vienna, the Crown Prince of Austria was supposed to be enjoying a few days of rest. That's what the palace said, anyway. In truth, Rudolf had been restless for months, writing strange letters, pacing at night, speaking in circles about freedom, politics, and death. Stephanie hadn't seen him for days. Their marriage had become a kind of long-distance performance. He played the tragic visionary. She played the silent wife. Vienna, always hungry for a story, had stopped pretending they were happy and started pretending it didn't matter. On the morning of January 30th, the news arrived, not with a scream, but with the heavy knock of protocol. 2 servants entered her chambers, pale and trembling. One carried a sealed letter. The other couldn't quite meet her eyes. It was the kind of silence that only precedes catastrophe. "His Imperial Highness," the first man said, "has been found dead." The words hung there, suspended between disbelief and inevitability. For a moment, Stephanie thought she'd misheard. Dead? Which part of him? The man or the prince? Because one of them had been dying for years. Then came the rest. Mary Vitsera, 17, beautiful, and inconveniently still clutched in his arms. 2 bodies, 1 pistol, endless speculation. The palace went into immediate lockdown. Servants were sworn to silence. Messages were intercepted. Curtains were drawn. Nothing spreads faster than scandal, except the empire's desperation to contain it. By afternoon, Vienna was whispering. By evening, it was roaring. Murder-suicide, they said. No. Assassination. No. A cover-up. No. An accident. Everyone had a theory, and all of them were wrong in different ways. The only truth was that 2 people were dead, and an empire had no idea what to do with grief that didn't fit the script. The emperor ordered the body brought back quietly. The empress collapsed. Ministers panicked. Priests debated whether Rudolf's soul was even eligible for burial in consecrated ground. The empire's moral fabric was unraveling, and everyone was pretending not to notice the holes. But no one thought to ask what it meant for her. For Stephanie, it was both a relief and a curse. Relief because the war between them was finally over, not with reconciliation, but with exhaustion. She no longer had to live waiting for the next humiliation, the next headline, the next whispered reminder of her failure. But it was a curse too, because his death didn't just take him, it took her identity with it. In a single night, she became something the court had no vocabulary for, a widow at 24. Too young to be tragic, too tainted to be sympathetic. The empire mourned its prince with pomp and opera house grief. Bells tolled, soldiers marched, and the newspapers wept ink. Mary Vetsera was erased from the official narrative. The girl became the incident. And Stephanie, she became the silence between sentences. She attended the funeral, of course. She had no choice. The cathedral was packed with nobles, diplomats, and mourners who wanted to be seen mourning. She stood among them, motionless, watching as they buried the man who had infected her, betrayed her, and now, through death, outshone her once again. She didn't cry. She didn't faint. She just stood still, because stillness, she'd learned, was the last dignity left to a disgraced woman. Later, when the condolences came, they all sounded the same. How unfortunate. How tragic. How very dreadful for the empire. Not one of them said, "How are you?" Because that wasn't the question. The question was, what would she do now? The answer, as it turned out, was nothing. Rudolf's death stripped her of everything. Her title, her status, her place in Vienna. She was no longer crown princess, no longer future empress, no longer useful. In a monarchy obsessed with continuity, she had become a historical footnote. Even her daughter was taken from her. Elizabeth Marie, barely 6, was placed under the emperor's supervision for stability. Stephanie received visiting rights, like a polite stranger. In letters, her father tried to console her. "You must be brave, my dear. You have suffered, yes. But remember, a king's daughter must never let suffering show." It was the royal equivalent of chin up. Vienna, meanwhile, turned its eyes away. The same city that had once cheered her wedding now pretended not to recognize her. Invitations stopped arriving. Former friends suddenly discovered they had other engagements. Her presence was a reminder of everything the empire wanted to forget: infidelity, disease, suicide, scandal. So she left. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply because staying felt indecent. She retreated to the countryside where the air was clean and the mirrors less cruel. Days passed quietly, unmeasured by ceremony or gossip. She walked alone, wrote letters that no one answered, and began to understand what ghosts must feel like. But Vienna couldn't resist one final cruelty: the rumors. They said she had driven Rudolf to despair, that her coldness had destroyed him, that her sterility had shamed him. Even in death, it seemed, he got the tragedy, and she got the blame. History, after all, has a habit of forgiving men their self-destruction while condemning women for surviving it. And survive she did, if you could call it that. At night she'd dream of the palace corridors, of the candlelight flickering over portraits, of footsteps fading behind her. She'd wake before dawn, unsure whether it was relief or grief that kept her heart beating. The infection, once whispered in doctors' Latin, had become a brand now, a permanent stain that followed her into every introduction, every conversation, every future possibility. She wasn't just a widow. She was the widow, the one everyone pitied in private and avoided in public. Rudolf's death had set her free from him, yes, but only by binding her to his memory forever. That's the cruel symmetry of royal tragedy. One dies, and the other becomes a living monument to it. Months later, while the empire moved on to its next crisis, Stéphanie was still navigating the quiet wreckage. Every letter of condolence she opened felt like another layer of ice forming around her. Every polite smile from a stranger reminded her that pity is just contempt in nicer clothing. In public, she was expected to represent grace. In private, she had no one left to represent it for. She once wrote, years later, that when she heard the news of his death, she felt as if a shadow had passed over the world. What she didn't write, what history couldn't record, was the relief beneath that shadow. Because the truth is, she didn't just lose a husband that night. She lost her captor, her future, and her last remaining illusion. The empire wept for its fallen prince, but not for the woman he left behind. He died in a hunting lodge, wrapped in scandal and myth. She lived on, wrapped in silence. The empire lost a crown prince. She lost the right to exist. They say travel broadens the mind, though in Stéphanie's case, it mostly thinned her patience. By the early 1890s, she had become Europe's most unwanted widow, too royal to ignore, too scandalous to include, and far too young to disappear quietly. Vienna had buried her in pity. Belgium pretended not to know her. So she did what all well-bred exiles eventually do. She went wandering. The newspapers called it a period of recuperation. In truth, it was a slow-motion escape. She drifted south, chasing climates and calm. Malta, Sicily, Corfu. Places warm enough that the cold in her chest might finally melt. Every port offered the same view: blue horizons, polite strangers, and the faint echo of languages she only half understood. She traveled light, carrying only books, a diary, and the kind of grief that doesn't fit neatly in a suitcase. Sometimes she attended society dinners, where local aristocrats treated her like a living museum piece, the princess who lost a prince. They'd lower their voices when they said it, as though tragedy were contagious. Stéphanie would smile politely, sip her wine, and imagine setting the tablecloth on fire just to feel alive again. But in the quieter hours, walking along seashores or sitting in small churches, she began to rediscover something unfamiliar. Peace. Not happiness exactly. She wasn't that reckless. Just a gentler kind of emptiness. The sort that didn't hurt to carry. It was in one of those quiet stretches, in the faded sunlight of the Mediterranean, that she met Count Artur Potocki. He was Polish, aristocratic but unpretentious, a man who somehow managed to make sadness look dignified. They met at a dinner in Sicily, where conversation had been going particularly badly until he said something witty about the wine being as old as its host. Stéphanie laughed, a real laugh, not the kind reserved for diplomacy. That was rare enough to be dangerous. Arthur was everything Rudolf hadn't been. Kind without agenda, attentive without arrogance. He didn't need her to be a princess or a symbol or anything other than a person. For the first time since girlhood, she found herself speaking freely about books, about music, about how ridiculous royal life seemed when viewed from a safe distance. They became inseparable, though never scandalous. Not in the way Vienna would have defined scandal anyway. They traveled together, read together, walked together. It wasn't passion that bound them, but companionship, the kind built on quiet empathy, two people who recognize the same fracture in each other. Of course, the universe, ever consistent in its cruelty, had other plans. Arthur fell ill not long after. The kind of illness polite society referred to as a lingering weakness. Cancer, though no one dared say it outright. Stéphanie stayed by his side through every stage, every hospital room, every whispered prognosis. She had once watched a man destroy himself. Now she watched one fade unwillingly. In his last weeks, Arthur apologized for dying, as if he'd broken a promise he'd never made. Stéphanie told him it was all right, but of course it wasn't. When he finally slipped away, she didn't cry. She had no tears left to spend. Grief, by then, was just another old companion. After his death, she wrote in her journal, "I have lived too many endings to believe in beginnings." And yet somehow she kept moving. Her wanderings became slower, more deliberate. She no longer searched for peace. She carried it like a fragile inheritance. Each city became a ghost. She didn't mind haunting for a while. Rome, Nice, Budapest. Wherever she went, she was the widow, though which widow depended on who was asking. Some remembered her as Rudolf's unfortunate bride, others as the Belgian princess who disappeared into rumor. She let them choose their version. In public, she remained composed, almost regal. But privately, she'd begun to develop a taste for irony. Once, when a French journalist asked whether she still believed in destiny, she replied, "Only the bad kind. It's far more reliable." Her father, King Leopold, of course, tried to turn even her widowhood into politics. He urged her to remarry, properly this time, preferably someone useful. She was 28, beautiful and available, 3 qualities he considered marketable assets. But Stéphanie had learned her lesson. She had married once for empire, and it had nearly killed her. The next marriage, if there ever was one, would be hers to choose. The letters from Belgium grew sharper with every refusal. Leopold accused her of selfishness, of neglecting her duty to the family name. She replied once, briefly, "I have already buried an empire. I will not marry another." That silenced him, temporarily. kings rarely understand when daughters begin to act like people. By the mid-1890s, Stéphanie had become something extraordinary in her world, a woman without a leash. She had no title worth envying, no position worth scheming for, and no illusions left to protect. And yet, she had never been freer. Freedom, of course, came at a price. She was lonely. Not tragically lonely, just quietly so. The kind that follows you like a shadow, but doesn't always bother to speak. Sometimes she'd catch sight of her reflection in a cafe window and barely recognize herself. Older, thinner, calmer. The princess she'd once been was gone. In her place was someone less ornamental, but far more real. In Vienna, they still spoke her name in past tense. In Brussels, they avoided it altogether. But in the soft anonymity of travel, she existed in the present. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a girl, standing in the marble corridors of the Belgian court, dreaming of crowns and waltzes. It was better, because it was hers. Of course, history wouldn't see it that way. History rarely celebrates women who save themselves quietly. It prefers the ones who die beautifully or suffer decoratively. Stéphanie did neither. She simply endured, stubbornly, elegantly, inconveniently alive. And if you asked her years later what she had learned from it all, she might have smiled that tired little smile of hers and said that empires are like men. They promise eternity, and then they leave you holding the bill. By the time the 1890s gave way to the next century, she was no longer drifting. She'd begun to think of finding a home again. Not a palace, not a gilded cage, just a place that didn't echo when she breathed. But before that chapter could begin, she stood once more at the edge of the sea, where the waves folded over themselves like tired memories. She thought of Rudolf, of Artur, of the girl she used to be. She thought of every version of herself that had lived and died along the way, and she thought, not sadly but almost amused, so this is what it feels like to live in the afterlife of your own life. The world would go on, with its courts and scandals and men who mistook power for permanence. But Stéphanie had finally stepped off the stage. She had played her part, buried her lines, and chosen silence over spectacle. And when the next suitor inevitably arrived, offering titles and expectations dressed as affection, she declined with royal precision. "I have already buried an empire," she said, and this time she meant it. By the time the century turned, Stéphanie of Belgium had earned a reputation across Europe for two things: bad luck and good posture. She had buried a husband, lost a kingdom, and collected more sympathy than she knew what to do with. Most women in her position would have retired to some quiet estate and devoted themselves to prayer, embroidery, or becoming vaguely mysterious. Stéphanie, however, had other plans. Because despite everything, the infections, the scandals, the funerals, she still wasn't done living. It was in Hungary around 1899 that she met Count Elmer Lonier. He was elegant, well-educated, disarmingly kind, and crucially, not a prince, which immediately made him the most interesting man she'd ever met. Elmer was a minor nobleman with major charm, the kind of person who could talk about philosophy without sounding like he was showing off. He didn't bow too deeply, didn't treat her like a relic, and most importantly, didn't flinch when people whispered about her past. For a woman who had spent most of her life being pitied, this was revolutionary behavior. They met at a dinner in Budapest, where the conversation had stalled somewhere between politics and dessert. Elmer, apparently bored of both, made a quiet joke about how every royal dinner eventually turned into a séance, everyone pretending to communicate with the dead, mostly their own reputations. Stephanie nearly choked on her wine. That was how it began, not with grand declarations, but with laughter, the kind that sounded dangerously alive. He visited her often after that. At first, under the respectable guise of friendship, then with the unmistakable urgency of love. It was a simple, unpretentious affection. No crowns, no obligations, no ghostly portraits of disappointed ancestors staring from the walls, which, of course, made it completely unacceptable to everyone else. When her father, King Leopold II, found out, he reacted with all the grace of a man discovering his investments had fallen in love with a poor. He called Elemer a provincial upstart and warned Stephanie that she was throwing away what little dignity remained. She replied, and this part is documented, that dignity was overrated. For the first time in her life, she refused to obey. Letters flew back and forth between Brussels and Budapest, each more condescending than the last. Leopold insisted she think of her duty. Stephanie reminded him that duty had given her disease, widowhood, and exile. She'd spent her entire life following orders. This time, she followed her heart. When she announced her intention to marry Elemer, the European press erupted in predictable outrage. A princess marrying a mere count. It was treated as an international downgrade, like trading a crown for a hat. But Stephanie didn't care. She'd already been through every kind of humiliation society could invent. What was one more headline? In March 1900, she married Elemer Lonier in a small ceremony. No crowds, no pomp, no endless procession of diplomats pretending to care. It was just two people, a priest, and a quiet certainty that they were doing something dangerous and right. And for that, she was promptly disowned. Her father stripped her of her royal status, her titles, and what little financial support she still received. From that day onward, she was no longer Her Imperial and Royal Highness Princess Stéphanie of Belgium. She was simply Countess Lonier. And to her great surprise, she liked the sound of it. For the first time, her name wasn't attached to someone else's power, not her father's, not her husband's, not an empire's. It was her own. Leopold never forgave her. He couldn't understand why anyone would choose love over prestige. This was a man, after all, who viewed affection as a bad investment. He cut her out of his will, out of his life, and, as far as he could manage, out of history. The Belgian court called her selfish. The Austrian court called her foolish. Stephanie called it Tuesday. She and Elemer settled at a quiet estate in Hungary, Rusovsche Castle, near Bratislava. It was modest compared to her previous residences, but it had warmth, laughter, and a kind of peace that no palace had ever given her. She tended to the gardens, read endlessly, and entertained a small circle of friends who weren't afraid of being honest. Of course, no royal escape is complete without a few lawsuits. When her father died in 1909, leaving most of his fortune to his mistress, Caroline Lacroix, Stephanie challenged the will and won a portion of the inheritance after years of bitter legal battles. The press loved it. The king's disobedient daughter strikes again. It made her sound rebellious and scandalous, which she found flattering. In truth, she'd simply learned that if the world insists on mislabeling you, you might as well make the label work. There were other storms too. Family feuds, betrayals, more lawsuits than anyone without a crown should ever need. Through it all, Stephanie stayed calm, occasionally amused, and always infuriatingly dignified. Eleanor once joked that nothing could scandalize her anymore. "I've been married to a Habsburg," she replied. "Everything else is a hobby." Their marriage was not the stuff of fairy tales, no sweeping drama, no tragic ending. Just two flawed people growing old together in defiance of every expectation. And that, for Stéphanie, was miracle enough. She began writing again, this time not in secret. Essays, reflections, small pieces of memoir. Her most famous book, I Should Have Been Empress, would come years later, an ironic title if there ever was one. It stopped abruptly at 1889, as if she'd drawn a curtain over half her life. Maybe she wanted control over what parts of her story the world was allowed to see. By the time the Great War rolled across Europe, she and Eleanor were living quietly in their Hungarian estate, watching the old empires burn from afar. The world that had defined her, the world of crowns, corsets, and calculated marriages, was collapsing. And for once, she wasn't trapped inside it. It's hard to say whether she felt vindicated or simply tired. Probably both. But when reporters later asked if she missed her royal life, she gave the perfect answer. "Not at all. I've finally learned what it means to breathe." The infection that once isolated her, the shame, the whispers, the stain on her name, had become something else entirely. Immunity. She had survived so many scandals that embarrassment no longer stuck. You can't shame a woman who's already lived through every kind of silence. In the end, it wasn't her crown that defined her, or her titles, or her tragedies. It was her refusal to let them keep her small. She had started life as a pawn in a royal chess game, married into madness, buried empires, and come out the other side not as a princess, but as a person. And if history never quite knew what to do with her, that was fine. She'd stopped caring what history thought long ago, once they called her infected. Now, she called herself free. And if you've listened this far without hitting subscribe, well, that's one more woman history almost forgot because no one bothered to remember her. Go on. Fix that. By 1914, Europe had finally done what it had been threatening to do for decades. Set itself on fire. Armies marched, empires collided, and all those carefully arranged royal family trees went up in smoke. The war that would end the old world began, quite ironically, with another royal assassination. And somewhere in Hungary, far from the front lines but not far enough from history, Stéphanie Launier, once princess, once widow, now reluctant philosopher, watched it unfold like someone rewatching a bad play she'd already been in. It must have felt strange, seeing every empire that had shaped her life slowly devour itself. Belgium, the land of her birth, was invaded by Germany. Austria-Hungary, the empire she had once been destined to rule, fought with Germany. In other words, both sides of her identity were now trying to kill each other. And she was left somewhere in the middle, wondering which flag she was supposed to pray under. When asked about her allegiances, she reportedly said, "I am loyal to peace," which during wartime is the most dangerous allegiance of all. Her husband, Count Eleanor, devoted himself to charity work, organizing medical relief for soldiers. Stéphanie did the same, quietly, without fanfare, sewing bandages and funding hospitals. She'd spent her youth being paraded as an ornament. Now she finally found value in being useful. But usefulness didn't erase guilt. Her father, King Leopold II, had died 5 years before the war began, though died might be too gentle a word. He'd simply stopped breathing while the world was still counting the cost of his sins. Belgium mourned him publicly, but privately, The country was still reckoning with the horror of his Congo Free State, a colony built on blood and rubber where millions perished under his regime. For years, Stéphanie had avoided thinking about it. It was easier to pretend she hadn't known. After all, daughters rarely choose the moral debts they inherit. But now, as the war filled Europe with the same kind of brutality her father had exported overseas, she couldn't escape the parallel. She had been raised in palaces where everything sparkled. But now she understood what the Polish had been hiding. It wasn't just her family's reputation that had been infected. It was the entire system that built empires on other people's bones. Perhaps that's why, in her later years, she became obsessed with the idea of atonement. She gave to charities, funded orphanages, supported causes that no one cared to thank her for. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The war dragged on, as wars tend to do. And when it finally ended in 1918, Europe was unrecognizable. Austria-Hungary, the empire that had defined her adult life, simply ceased to exist. Gone, dissolved into borders and bitterness. Vienna went from imperial capital to a city of ghosts, its grandeur reduced to memory and dust. The titles she had once been stripped of no longer meant anything, because there were no titles left to strip. The world moved on. Stéphanie remained, alive, unclaimed, and curiously irrelevant. It was, in a way, her final revenge against history, outliving it. She and Elimér stayed at Rusovsha, their quiet Hungarian estate, watching the parade of new governments rise and fall like waves. They were neither rich nor poor, neither royal nor ordinary, just two people out of fashion with the times. And yet, even in her quiet retirement, history found ways to keep haunting her, this time in the form of her daughter. Elizabeth Marie, the only child of her ill-fated marriage to Rudolf, had grown into everything the Habsburgs feared: outspoken, idealistic, and scandalously modern. While her mother valued discretion, Elizabeth valued revolution. In post-war Vienna, she became known as the Red Archduchess, a socialist who hosted meetings of intellectuals and radicals in her apartment, where once mighty aristocrats were now waiters and chauffeurs. It was almost poetic, the child of a doomed empire hosting tea for the people who wanted to abolish empires altogether. To Stéphanie, it was unthinkable. The daughter she'd raised to curtsy before emperors was now quoting Marx. Their letters became increasingly strained. "You speak of equality," Stéphanie wrote once, "as though it were not simply another form of envy." Elizabeth replied, "And you speak of duty as if it hadn't already killed enough people." They rarely spoke again after that, and so, as her daughter built a new identity out of rebellion, Stéphanie remained in the ruins of the old one. She wasn't bitter, just tired. There's a difference. She had outlasted two monarchs, one husband, one lover, and one empire. What more was there to fight for? Perhaps this is why, in the 1930s, she began writing her memoirs. Not for fame, the world had already forgotten her, but for understanding. A quiet autopsy of her own life. She called it Ich sollte Kaiserin werden. I should have been empress. It's a title that sounds tragic until you realize it's actually ironic. Stéphanie knew better than anyone that being empress would have just meant dying more expensively. She wrote in longhand, in careful, deliberate prose, the kind that sounds polite until you realize it's actually furious. She recounted her childhood in Belgium, her marriage to Rudolf, the infection, the tragedy, the exile. Every line felt like a confession written through gritted teeth. And then, halfway through her life story, she stopped. The book ends in 1889. the year of Mayerling. No mention of Arthur, Elemer, the war, the daughter, or the long, strange peace that followed. It's as if she drew a curtain across her life and decided that the rest was none of history's business. Maybe it was her final act of control to choose which version of herself survived. When it was published in 1935, critics called it evasive. She has written half her life, one reviewer said, and concealed the better half. But that's precisely the point. Stéphanie had spent her youth being dissected by rumor, scandal, and judgment. This time, she chose the silence. She edited her own story the way history had always edited women's, selectively, strategically, but on her own terms. By then, she was in her 70s. The world had moved on to new wars, new tragedies, new distractions. Her name appeared only in footnotes. The infected princess, the Mayerling widow, the forgotten daughter of Leopold II. But she didn't mind. Not anymore. She would sit by the window of her study, her pen scratching softly against the page, while the Hungarian countryside turned gold in the fading light. At her desk, a single line in fresh ink. I was to be empress. And then, nothing. No flourish. No farewell. Just the sound of her pen stopping mid-thought, as if she'd realized that the rest of her life no longer needed to be explained. After all, she had lived long enough to know that history always prefers its ghosts silent. And Stéphanie Launier, once princess, once scandal, now peaceably forgotten, was finally content to haunt it quietly. By the time the Second World War began, Stéphanie Launier had already seen one empire rise, one collapse, and one reinvent itself as nostalgia. She was, by then, 80 years old, which in historical years is practically immortal. And she'd learned that the world's talent for destruction only improved with age. Europe was burning again. And this time she didn't even bother pretending to be surprised. The newspapers spoke of alliances and invasions, but to Stéphanie, it all sounded painfully familiar. Men in uniforms, speeches about destiny, and borders redrawn like bad sketches. History had a habit of repeating itself, mostly because it never bothered to apologize the first time. By the early 1940s, she and her husband Elemer were living quietly in their Hungarian estate, Rusovce. The war crept closer each year, and with it came rationing, fear, and a sense that the civilized world was once again being devoured by its own cleverness. Elemer, ever the calm one, reassured her that they would be fine, that age and obscurity made them uninteresting targets. Stéphanie wasn't so sure. She had been uninteresting to the world for decades, and yet trouble had always found her anyway. When the bombs began to fall on nearby cities, she made a decision that startled everyone, perhaps even herself. She would retreat to an abbey. Not for religion. That ship had sailed years ago, somewhere between Rudolf's scandals and Leopold's sins. But for silence. She'd spent her entire life being watched, judged, and remembered for all the wrong reasons. Now, she wanted only to disappear properly. So she packed a few books, her rosary, and her old diaries, kissed Elemer goodbye, and moved into the Pannonhalma Abbey, a Benedictine monastery high on a hill in western Hungary. The abbey was ancient, austere, and indifferent to history, which was exactly what she loved about it. The monks didn't care that she had once been a princess, or that her name had been whispered in scandal. They gave her a small room, a window that looked out over the vineyards, and the kind of peace that came without conditions. Her days settled into a quiet rhythm. Morning bells, bread and tea, walks through the cloister gardens. In the afternoons, She wrote letters, not to anyone in particular, but to memory itself. Notes to the people she had lost, the lives she had lived, and the versions of herself that had come and gone like empires. Sometimes she reread old newspaper clippings that mentioned her, the infected princess, the Mayerling widow, the disobedient daughter. She'd shake her head, smile faintly, and think, well, at least they spelled it right this time. Her health was failing, but slowly, politely, as if even death was hesitant to bother her. Ellemer visited often, traveling the long road to the abbey with flowers and gossip from the outside world. He was older too, softer around the edges, still devoted. They'd sit together by her window, watching the hills fade into evening. She'd tease him for his stubborn optimism. He'd remind her that she was just as stubborn, only with better posture. And when he left, she'd watch him go until he disappeared down the hill, the last familiar figure in a life full of ghosts. The infection that had once defined her was long gone, but its echo remained, not in her body, but in the way the world still whispered her name. She had survived illness, scandal, war, exile, and irrelevance, and yet history had chosen to remember her as the infected princess. It was strange, she thought, how people could live entire lives and still be reduced to one word. For her father, it was tyrant. For Rudolf, tragedy. For her, infected. But there, in the abbey, the words finally lost their power. She'd outlasted them all, the gossip, the empires, even the idea of being remembered. Sometimes she would pray, not for salvation, but for humor. "Dear God," she'd murmur, "if you have a sense of irony, you owe me a very good afterlife." By the summer of 1945, the war was ending. The radio crackled with news of Germany's surrender, and for the first time in years, the bells of the abbey rang in celebration instead of warning. The monks rejoiced quietly. Stephanie just smiled and said, "So, the world's learned nothing again." A few weeks later, in August, she fell ill. Not dramatically, no fevers, no long speeches, no operatic finale, just a gradual fading, the kind that feels more like forgetting than dying. Ellemer was at her side. He read to her from her favorite books, Hungarian poetry, old letters, and once, amusingly, a travel guide to Belgium. She laughed weakly and told him to skip the part about Brussels. She already knew how it ended. Her final days were peaceful, even elegant. She spoke of her mother, her daughter, and occasionally of Rudolf, though without bitterness now, only curiosity. "I wonder," she said once, "if he ever found what he was looking for. I hope it wasn't as disappointing as what I found." On August 23, 1945, the same week the last embers of the Second World War went out, Stéphanie Launier slipped quietly from life. No headlines, no trumpets, no grand farewell. She was 81 years old. The world, busy congratulating itself on surviving another catastrophe, barely noticed. She was buried beside Ellemer in a small cemetery near the abbey. No crown, no court, no ceremony. Just a few monks, a handful of flowers, and the sound of the wind moving through the vines. Her grave reads simply, Countess Stéphanie Launier, 1864-1945. No titles, no tragedies, just a name, finally her own. And in that simplicity, there was a strange perfection, because while the world had spent decades defining her by scandal and sorrow, she had quietly written her own ending. One without spectacle, one without infection, one without apology. The war ended. Empires crumbled. New nations drew borders over the bones of the old ones. And somewhere beneath Hungarian soil, A woman who had once been the center of European gossip finally found peace. No marble monument, no gilded epitaph, just silence, the one luxury she'd never been allowed in life. History forgot her, of course. It always does. She was too inconvenient for fairy tales and too ordinary for legend. But forgetting, as she might have said, is just another form of infection. And perhaps if the world still whispers her story now and then, in rooms like this, in voices like yours, then she hasn't been forgotten after all. They said she was infected, but perhaps she was only human. When history calls a woman infected, it's never really about her blood. It's about her defiance, about a woman who refused to stay in the shape she was given. Stéphanie of Belgium was born to obey, trained to endure, and expected to disappear gracefully. Instead, she survived, awkwardly, imperfectly, stubbornly. Empires rose and fell around her, but she remained. A living reminder that obedience doesn't always guarantee safety, and silence doesn't always keep you pure. And isn't that the cruel joke of history? That we remember the kings who conquered and the men who fell in war, but not the women who had to live through the aftermath, stitching up nations and families alike, all while pretending not to feel the sting. You, right now, lying there, listening, half asleep, half awake, you've walked among ghosts tonight. You've heard the story of a princess who lost everything except her will to remain real. And here's the quiet truth. She never asked to be pitied. She just wanted to be seen. Not as a scandal, not as a symbol, just as herself. So as you drift toward sleep, remember her. That's all she ever wanted, to be remembered honestly. Not for her title, not for her mistakes, but for the simple, radical act of surviving when the world had decided she shouldn't. And if you're still awake, before the night carries you off completely, go ahead and subscribe. Not for me, but for her. For every forgotten woman who endured her own empire and lived long enough to watch it fall. Because when you do, you're not just supporting this little corner of storytelling. You're helping to keep their stories alive. You're saying, we see you now. And maybe that's what history's been missing all along. Someone awake enough to listen. They said she was infected, but perhaps she was simply human, unflinching, imperfect, and unforgettable. And if you've stayed with me to the very end, thank you. You're not just keeping history alive, you're keeping me here too.